The old cabin had stood for 60 years before nature reclaimed it in a single night. Martha and Harold Greene surveyed what remained of their mountain home, splintered beams, scattered memories, and the crushing weight of starting over at 80. Their weathered hands, once strong enough to build this place from nothing, now trembled at the impossible task ahead. 3 miles away, 12-year-old Elijah watched from his family's porch as the storm tore through the valley. While others whispered about the tragedy, Elijah quietly gathered his father's tools. Could the hands of a child really rebuild what decades of mountain life had established? Could wisdom flow upstream from youth to experience? The morning light filtered through broken beams, casting fractured shadows across what remained of the Greenes' living room. Martha knelt among the debris, her arthritic fingers carefully extracting a leather-bound album from beneath a fallen shelf. Miraculously, it had survived mostly intact, though water damage had blurred the edges of several photographs. "Harold," she called, her voice thin against the mountain air. "I found the album." Harold made his way carefully across the unstable flooring, the walking stick he'd fashioned from a branch creaking under his weight. His weathered face brightened momentarily as he lowered himself beside his wife of 58 years. "Look at us," Martha whispered, pointing to a sepia-toned image of themselves as newlyweds, standing proudly before the cabin's original frame. "We were so young then." Harold's calloused thumb traced the outline of their younger selves. "We built it once," he said, more to himself than to Martha. "But that was different times, different bodies." They turned the pages slowly, each photograph a timestamp of their life together. Their children playing on the porch that now lay in splinters, Christmases around the stone fireplace, now a pile of scattered rock. The last family reunion 5 years ago, before their son moved to Australia and their daughter became too busy with her corporate career to make the journey up the mountain. "They've been calling," Martha said, as if reading his thoughts. "Robert wants us to come stay with him in Phoenix." Harold's jaw tightened. In one of those retirement communities, surrounded by strangers playing shuffleboard, and Lisa offered to help with an apartment in Denver, close to her. "An apartment," Harold repeated, the word foreign on his tongue, "with neighbors stacked above and below like cordwood." Martha closed the album, clutching it to her chest. "What choice do we have, Harold? We can't stay here. And we certainly can't rebuild, not at our age." Harold stood with effort, gazing out through the missing wall to the mountains beyond. These peaks had been his compass points for 6 decades. The thought of concrete horizons and artificial lighting made something inside him wither. "The Johnsons said we can stay with them until we figure things out," Martha continued, gathering a few more salvageable items into a plastic bin. "Their spare room is small, but it'll do for now." Harold nodded, wordless. His eyes fell on the cedar chest that had somehow remained intact. Inside were the remnants of their life: birth certificates, their marriage license, military discharge papers, the deed to land that now held only wreckage. "We should call Robert back," Martha said, her pragmatism taking over as she carefully wrapped a miraculously unbroken teacup in a dishcloth. "He said, there's a waiting list for that community, the one with the good medical facilities nearby." Harold's silence was answer enough. Martha sighed, understanding the weight of what they were losing, not just a home, but independence, identity, purpose. "We've had a good run here," she offered softly. The afternoon stretched on as they salvaged what they could, pitifully little against a lifetime of accumulation. Every now and then Martha would pause, overcome by a memory tied to some recovered object. The chipped serving platter from their 40th anniversary, the hand-carved Christmas ornaments, the quilt her mother had made, now soiled beyond redemption. As daylight began to fade, Harold insisted on one final walk around the property. Martha watched from what remained of the porch as his stooped figure moved slowly along the perimeter they had once proudly defended against nature's slow encroachment. Now nature had reclaimed it all at once, without negotiation. When he returned, his eyes were red-rimmed but dry. "The Johnsons will be here at 9 tomorrow. Martha reminded him. We should finish packing what we can. Harold nodded, taking one last look at the setting sun casting golden light across the devastation. I never thought we'd leave this place except in pine boxes, he said quietly. Martha slipped her hand into his, her wedding band gleaming dully against their intertwined fingers. I know, she whispered. I know. That night, they made a makeshift bed in the only corner still protected by partial walls and ceiling. Tomorrow would bring the indignity of becoming guests, then depend. But tonight, they would sleep one last time on their mountain, under their stars, even if the roof that had once sheltered them was now open to the vast, indifferent sky. 3 miles down the mountain, 12-year-old Elijah Murphy sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, meticulously arranging tools in a hand-crafted wooden box. Each tool had its designated space, chisels graduated by size, hammers nested beside one another, a collection of screwdrivers organized by type and function. Some were standard issue from the hardware store, but others bore the marks of customization: handles, rewrapped with leather strips, metal parts polished to a soft gleam from years of use. Elijah, dinner's ready, his mother called from downstairs. Coming, he replied, carefully placing a hand planer in its foam-lined compartment. The Murphy cabin was modest but sturdy, built by Elijah's father James and expanded twice as their family grew. Unlike most children in the valley who attended the consolidated school 30 miles away, Elijah was homeschooled, partly due to the treacherous winter roads, partly because of his parents' belief in practical education. At the dinner table, conversation inevitably turned to the storm's aftermath. Pastor William says the relief fund raised almost $2,000. Sarah, Elijah's mother, reported as she passed a bowl of stew. Not nearly enough for rebuilding, but it might help the Greens with temporary housings. James nodded, breaking a piece of cornbread. I stopped by the site today. It's worse than I thought. Foundations cracked in 3 places. Are they really moving to Arizona? Elijah's 16-year-old sister Emma asked. That's the talk, James confirmed. Their son's been trying to get them to move closer to him for years. Guess now they don't have much choice. Elijah ate quietly, absorbing every word. While other adults in the community saw him as just another child, those who knew him recognized something different in his thoughtful silence. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but when he did, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. Miss Greene taught me how to identify edible mushrooms last fall. Elijah finally said his grandfather showed him when he was my age. Sarah exchanged a glance with James. It's sad, honey. They've been fixtures on this mountain longer than most of us have been alive. After dinner, Elijah returned to his room and pulled out a sketchbook from beneath his mattress. Inside were detailed drawings, not the spaceships or superheroes typical of boys his age, but architectural renderings, cross-sections of buildings, and joinery techniques he'd observed from his father's work. James Murphy was known throughout the county for his carpentry skills, and Elijah had been his shadow since he could walk. The newest pages contained something different: measurements, angles and material calculations for a cabin. Not just any cabin, one specifically designed for elderly occupants, with wider doorways, fewer stairs and strategically placed supports. A gentle knock interrupted his concentration. Still up? His father asked, poking his head in. Elijah quickly flipped the sketchbook closed, but not before James caught a glimpse of the drawings. That's some detailed work, James said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Mind if I take a look? Reluctantly, Elijah handed over the sketchbook. His father's eyebrows rose as he turned each page, taking in the precision of the lines, the careful notations, the thoughtful adaptations. You've been watching more than I realized, James said finally, a new respect in his voice. Elijah shrugged. I listened too. These adaptations, James tapped the page. Low shelving, reinforced bathroom walls for grab bars. You're thinking about the Greens, aren't you? Elijah nodded. It wouldn't have to be fancy, just solid, safe. James studied his son's face. At 12, Elijah still had the softness of childhood, but his eyes held an old soul's wisdom. James had seen it when Elijah, rehabilitated an injured hawk the previous spring, and again when he'd figured out how to modify the neighbor's tractor after the man lost fingers in an accident. "It's a nice thought, son," James said gently, "but rebuilding takes money, materials, manpower. The Greens don't have insurance that covers this kind of damage." "I know," Elijah said, taking back the sketchbook. "I was just thinking." After his father left, Elijah reopened the book and continued working on his designs until well past midnight. In the corner of his room, an old coffee can, labeled Building Fund, contained his life savings, $243 from odd jobs, birthday money and the sale of hand-carved fishing lures he made during winter months. It wasn't nearly enough, and he knew it. But somewhere between mathematics and impossibility lived the stubbornness that defined mountain people, and in that space, Elijah Murphy was formulating a plan. Dawn broke crisp and clear as Martha and Harold prepared for departure. The Johnsons' pickup would arrive soon, marking the end of 60 years on their mountain homestead. "Did you pack your medications?" Martha asked, methodically working through her mental checklist. Harold nodded absently, kneeling before a small metal footlocker he'd extracted from beneath fallen beams. The latch was stiff with rust and disuse. When it finally yielded, he paused before lifting the lid, as if opening a time capsule. Inside lay his military effects, discharge papers, medals in tarnished cases, a folded American flag, and atop it all, his veteran's cap. The simple blue cap with gold embroidery had accompanied him to every Memorial Day service, 4th of July parade, and veterans' funeral since night. Harold lifted it gently, brushing dust from the emblem. Faded stitching proclaimed, "Korean War Veteran, 7th Infantry Division." "I thought this was lost," he murmured, turning it in his hands. Martha paused her packing. "You should wear it today. Might help the Johnsons recognize there's still some dignity left in these old bones." Harold placed it on his head, the familiar weight offering strange comfort amidst chaos. In the reflection of a broken window he barely recognized himself. The proud soldier, now an old man displaced forces beyond his control. "Feels like retreating," he said quietly. Martha stopped beside him, her hand finding his shoulder. "This isn't surrender, Harold. It's a strategic repositioning." Her attempt at military terminology brought a ghost of a smile to his lips. The hours passed, with final decisions. What few possessions would accompany them, what would remain for potential salvage later. The choices were painful, each item weighted with memories. A rocking chair built when their first child was expected. Martha's mother's china, miraculously unbroken in its hutch. Books waterlogged beyond saving. Harold's workshop tools too heavy and numerous to transport. By noon, their life had been distilled to 3 suitcases and 5 cardboard boxes. "We're here," Frank Johnson's voice called from outside, followed by the slam of a truck door. As Martha greeted their neighbors turned saviors, Harold took a final walk through the ruins. In what had been their bedroom, he paused at the dresser, where Martha's jewelry box remained intact, the delicate ballerina inside still poised in perpetual arabesque. He pocketed it as a surprise for later. "Ready when you are, Harold," Frank called, already loading boxes. "Just a minute," Harold replied, his voice catching. He stood in what remained of the doorway, committing to memory the view he'd woken to for most of his life. The sloping meadow leading to pine forest, the distant peaks sketched against blue sky. The drive to the Johnsons was mostly silent. Harold watched through the passenger window as their mountain receded in the distance. His cap sat on his lap now, fingers absently tracing the embroidery. "You two get settled in," Louise Johnson fussed once they arrived, showing them to a small but comfortable guest room. "I've put fresh towels in the bathroom, and dinner's at 6. Left alone, Martha began unpacking while Harold sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "It's temporary," Martha reminded him, hanging dresses in the closet. "Just until we decide about Robert's offer." Harold nodded, but they both recognized the platitude. At 80, starting over wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. That evening, after a strained dinner of polite conversation and pitying glances, Harold stepped onto the Johnsons' back porch. The stars were different from this angle, the mountain a dark shadow against the night sky. He thought of his cap, left atop the dresser in their temporary room, and all it represented: youthful strength, purpose, overcoming adversity. Inside, the telephone rang. Martha answered, her voice drifting through the screen door. "Yes, Robert, we're settled for now." "No, I don't think so. I understand there's a waiting list." "Yes, your father's fine, just adjust." Harold tuned out the conversation, focusing instead on the distant outline of their mountain. Miles away, under moonlight that silvered the destruction, a small figure moved carefully through the wreckage of the Greene cabin. Elijah's flashlight beam swept methodically across broken floorboards and collapsed walls. He carried a measuring tape, notebook, and his father's level, pausing occasionally to jot measurements or test the stability of remaining structures. Near what had been the front entrance, something caught his eye, a patch of blue amid splintered wood. Kneeling, he extracted Harold's veteran cap, forgotten in the emotional rush of departure. Elijah brushed it clean, studying the embroidered insignia with reverence. Carefully, he placed it in his backpack, a tangible connection to the man whose home he now surveyed with determination beyond his years. 3 days into their stay at the Johnsons', Martha had established a routine that gave structure to their displacement. Mornings were spent helping Louise with household chores, tasks that allowed Martha to feel useful rather than burdensome. Afternoons found her on the porch, making calls to insurance adjusters who offered little hope, and to Robert, whose patience was wearing thin with his parents' reluctance to commit to Arizona. Harold, meanwhile, grew increasingly withdrawn. He spent hours in Frank's workshop, not building anything, just running his hands over tools similar to those he'd lost. Sometimes he disappeared for long walks, returning with muddy boots and a distant expression that worried Martha. "He went up there again, didn't he?" Martha asked when Frank returned from searching for Harold one evening. Frank nodded, removing his hat. "Found him standing in what's left of your kitchen, just staring at nothing." "He's mourning," Louise said gently, passing Martha a cup of tea. "Men do it differently than we do." That night, Martha woke to find Harold's side of the bed empty. She found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, brochures for retirement communities, assisted living pamphlets, listings for small apartments in Denver. "We have options," he said without looking up. "None of them good." Martha sat beside him, taking his hand. "We have each other. That's not nothing." 3 miles away, Elijah spread meticulously drawn blueprints across the Murphy family's dining table. His father, James, studied them with professional attention, asking occasional questions about load-bearing calculations and material estimates. "You've thought this through," James said finally, looking at his son with newfound respect. "But Elijah, this would take professional builders months, not to mention 20,000 in materials alone." "We could use salvaged lumber from the Collins' old barn," Elijah countered, "and riverstone for the foundation reinforcement." "Son, I've calculated everything," Elijah insisted, flipping to detailed material lists and cost projections. "If we get help from the church group and use the relief fund money for specialized materials." Sarah Murphy watched from the doorway, a mixture of pride and concern on her face. "Honey, it's a beautiful thought, but the Greenes are already making arrangements to leave." "They don't want to go," Elijah said with quiet certainty. "Mr. Greene especially. He belongs on that mountain." James exchanged glances with his wife. "How do you know that?" "I just do," Elijah replied, then hesitated before reaching into his backpack. He placed Harold's veteran cap on top of the blueprints. "This belongs to him. I found it in the rubble." James picked up the cap, examining the Korean War insignia. "Your grandfather fought in that war," he said quietly. "I know," Elijah nodded. "That's how I recognized it." A moment of silence filled the room. 3 generations connected by the simple blue cap. "Even if, and it's a big if, we could get materials donated." James began, "and even if we could get volunteer labor, we'd need the Greens' permission. And frankly, I'm not sure they'd want charity." "It's not charity," Elijah insisted. "It's community." The next morning, James made a few calls to the pastor, to a lumber supplier he'd done work for, to friends with construction experience. By afternoon, what had seemed impossible began taking tentative shape. Not a guarantee, but a possibility. "We should talk to them," Sarah suggested. Before this goes any further, the Murphy family arrived at the Johnsons just as Harold returned from another solitary walk. Introductions were made on the front porch, with Elijah hanging back, suddenly shy in Harold's weathered presence. "We had an idea we wanted to run past you," James began carefully. Inside, over coffee and Louise's apple cake, James outlined the possibility, a community effort to rebuild, using donated materials and volunteer labor. Harold's expression remained impassive, but Martha's eyes grew bright with cautious hope. "We can't accept such charity," Harold said stiffly. "With respect, sir," James replied, "when my father lost his arm in the sawmill accident 15 years ago, you were first to organize the planting and harvesting so we didn't lose our crops. This is no different." An uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Elijah stepped forward and placed the architectural drawings on the coffee table. They weren't the rough sketches from his notebook, but professionally rendered plans, detailed, precise, beautiful in their practical elegance. "I designed it for you," he said, finding his voice. "The bedrooms are on the main floor, so there's no stairs to climb. The doorways are wider than standard. There's extra insulation to keep heating costs down in winter." Harold stared at the boy, then at the drawings. His hands, spotted with age but still strong, hovered over the blueprints, as if touching something sacred. "You drew these?" he asked. Elijah nodded, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the veteran's cap. "This is yours too. I found it when I was measuring the old foundation." Harold took the cap, turning it over in his hands. A muscle worked in his jaw as he struggled with emotion. "When did you do all this measuring?" Martha asked. "After you left," Elijah admitted. "I hope that was okay." Harold stood abruptly and walked to the window, cap clutched in his fist, back rigid. Martha exchanged worried glances with the others. "Harold," she ventured. "It wouldn't be the same," he said finally, his voice rough. "Nothing could be." "No, sir," Elijah agreed. "It would be better, because it would be built to last another 60 years. For 3 days following the meeting at the Johnsons', Harold remained non-committal about Elijah's proposal. He asked practical questions about permits and septic systems, but gave no indication of his true feelings. Martha, meanwhile, had begun to hope, calling their son to postpone any decisions about Arizona. On the 4th morning, Harold announced he was going fishing. Martha knew it was his way of seeking clarity. Harold had always claimed to do his best thinking with a line in the water. He borrowed Frank's pickup and drove off before dawn. Instead of heading to his usual fishing spot, Harold found himself on the rutted dirt road leading to their destroyed cabin. As he rounded the final bend, he was startled to see a small figure amid the rubble, methodically sorting debris into piles. Elijah looked up at the sound of the truck, surprise quickly replaced by determination on his young face. He straightened, shovel in hand, as Harold approached. "What are you doing here, boy?" Harold asked, harsher than he intended. "Clearing the site," Elijah replied simply, returning to his work. "Salvaging what can be reused." Harold watched as the boy separated usable lumber from broken pieces, placing intact bricks in one stack, salvageable fixtures in another. Despite his small stature, Elijah worked with surprising efficiency. "Your parents know you're here." Elijah nodded. "Mom packed me lunch." Harold stood awkwardly, feeling useless in the face of such uncomplicated purpose. Finally, he reached for a pair of work gloves that lay atop a nearby toolbox. "Those foundation stones are too heavy for you," he said gruffly. "I'll handle them." They worked side by side through the morning, speaking little. Harold found himself impressed by Elijah's methodical approach. This was no child's impulsive project, but a carefully planned reclamation. Around noon, Elijah unwrapped sandwiches his mother had packed. Offering half to Harold, they sat on a fallen beam, looking out over the mountain vista. "Why are you doing this?" Harold finally asked. "You barely know us." Elijah considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "My grandpa used to say we're all just borrowing this mountain from each other," he said eventually. "When someone needs help, you give it. That's how everyone survives up here." Harold studied the boy's profile, recognizing something that transcended age, a mountain wisdom passed through generations. "I'm 80 years old," Harold said. "Even if we rebuild, Martha and I might not have many years left here." "Then those years should be good ones," Elijah replied simply. After lunch, Harold helped Elijah clear a section where the new foundation would begin. The boy explained his thinking, how the new cabin would be positioned to maximize morning sunlight for warmth, how the roof angle would prevent snow buildup, how the porch would offer the same view but with safer, wider steps. As the afternoon lengthened, trucks began arriving. James Murphy and 2 men from church, then Frank Johnson, then Pastor Williams. They brought tools, lumber salvaged from other projects, offers of help. No one made a big production of it. They simply showed up and asked where to start. Harold found himself directing operations, pointing out where support beams had stood, explaining the peculiarities of the mountainside terrain. For the first time since the storm, purpose straightened his spine. At day's end, the site was cleared, and the area for the new foundation marked with stakes and string. One corner overlapped with the original foundation. Elijah's idea, linking old and new. "This doesn't commit you to anything," James told Harold as they packed up tools, "just clearing the way in case you decide to go forward." Harold nodded, looking at the freshly marked ground. In the fading light, he could almost see the ghost of their old cabin, superimposed over Elijah's vision of the new one. As the others departed, Elijah remained, carefully placing a large, flat stone at the corner where old foundation met new outline. "What's that?" Harold asked. "First foundation stone," Elijah explained. "In the old days they'd put a coin under it for luck." Harold reached into his pocket and withdrew a Korean War commemorative coin he'd carried for decades. With a ceremonial gesture that surprised even himself, he bent and placed it beneath the stone as Elijah steadied it. "There," Harold said, his voice rough with emotion. "Now it's official." Elijah's smile was brief, but brilliant in the gathering dusk. Together they stood looking at the single stone, a modest beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. When Harold returned to the Johnsons that evening, Martha took one look at his face and knew the decision had been made, not with words or formal declarations, but with a foundation stone and the simple act of working alongside a boy who saw not what was lost, but what could be built. Word spread quickly through the mountain community. What began as Elijah's impossible dream transformed into a collective mission when James Murphy posted a simple sign-up sheet on the community board outside the general store. "Green cabin rebuild, volunteers needed." By week's end, the sheet overflowed with names, forcing Louise Johnson to create a proper schedule on her computer. The printout now hung prominently in the Johnsons' kitchen, a grid of times and tasks that gave structure to the ambitious project. "I never expected this," Martha confessed, studying the names. Some were familiar neighbors, others distant acquaintances, a few complete strangers from valleys beyond. "Mountain folk take care of their own," Louise replied, adding another name to Saturday's framing crew. "Always have." On that first official Saturday, Harold arrived at the site at dawn to find James already there with his truck loaded with lumber, not the salvaged pieces they'd planned to use, but fresh-cut pine. "Henderson's mill donated it," James explained. "Old man Henderson said he owed you for pulling his grandson from Miller Creek during that flood back in '98. Harold shook his head in disbelief. "That was 27 years ago. Mountain memory runs deep," James smiled. By mid-morning, the site bustled with activity. Men Harold had known for decades worked alongside teenagers he barely recognized. Women arrived with coolers of food and drinks. Pastor William set up a canopy for shade, beneath which Martha organized the growing operation. Elijah moved through it all with quiet authority, referring to his plans, answering questions, demonstrating techniques he'd learned from watching his father. Despite being the youngest person on site, his vision guided every decision. Harold found himself paired with Bill Cooper, a retired contractor who'd moved to the mountains 5 years earlier. Together, they marked foundation lines while discussing the merits of various insulation methods. "Smart design," Cooper commented, reviewing Elijah's blueprints. "Wouldn't change a thing." By lunchtime, the foundation trenches were dug, forms set for concrete. The atmosphere resembled an old-fashioned barn-raising, purposeful work, punctuated by laughter, stories, the occasional good-natured disagreement over technique. Martha presided over the food table, directing volunteers with the efficiency that had once managed a household of 5. Watching her, Harold saw glimpses of the younger woman who had tackled mountain life with unwavering determination before arthritis had stolen her dexterity, before fatigue had become her constant companion. "Your grandson's quite the architect," Bill Cooper told Harold, nodding toward Elijah. Harold started to correct him, then stopped. The relationship defied simple explanation. "Yes," he agreed instead. As afternoon shadows lengthened, concrete was poured into the foundation forms, a milestone celebrated with cold beers for the adults, root beer for the teenagers, and a solemn cup of coffee presented to Elijah by Harold himself. "To solid beginnings," Harold said, raising his cup. Elijah's smile, rare and genuine, transformed his serious face. "Yes, sir," James approached as the workers began cleaning up for the day. "We've got crews scheduled every weekend," he told Harold, "and some evenings during the week. At this rate, we might have the frame up within 2 weeks." "I want to do more than just supervise," Harold said, an edge of frustration in his voice. "These hands still work, even if they're slower." James studied the older man thoughtfully. "Actually, there is something. Several of these young folks have never built anything substantial. They're eager, but green. They could use some guidance on traditional joinery, especially for those support beams." Harold straightened, recognizing the offer for what it was, not charity but respect for his knowledge. "I could set up some demonstrations," he suggested. "Show them how we built things before everything came prefabricated." "That would be invaluable," James agreed. As the volunteers departed, Harold lingered, watching Elijah make final measurements before sunset. The boy moved with the focused precision of someone much older, checking his work twice, making careful notations in a worn notebook. "You did this," Harold said when they were alone. "You started something impossible." Elijah looked up, squinting against the low sun. "Not impossible," he corrected. "Just difficult. There's a difference." "Yes, sir. Impossible means you don't try. Difficult means you try harder." Harold chuckled, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. "When did you get so wise?" Elijah shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. "My dad says I was born with an old soul." Looking at the day's progress, concrete setting in forms, lumber stacked and ready, tools arranged for the next day's work, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since the storm: anticipation. Not just for the finished cabin, but for tomorrow's labor, for the learning and teaching, for the simple satisfaction of building. As they walked to James's waiting truck, Harold noticed the sign-up sheet Elijah carried: names and times, skills and commitments, a community condensed onto a single page. "May I?" Harold asked, holding out his hand. The sheet was creased and smudged from being consulted throughout the day. Some names Harold had known all his life, others were strangers, but together they formed something profound, a promise made manifest, neighbor to neighbor, across generations. The Johnsons' kitchen had become command central for the cabin rebuilding effort. While men hauled lumber and poured concrete, women gathered around Louise's worn oak table to coordinate meals, childcare, and the 100 other necessities that kept the project moving forward. At the center of this domestic operation sat Martha, A faded recipe book opened before her. Its leather binding was cracked with age, its pages stained and dog-eared from decades of use. Some recipes bore her mother's handwriting, others her own, creating a culinary genealogy that spanned generations. "We'll need to feed 20 on Saturday," Louise calculated, consulting the volunteer schedule, plus whoever shows up unannounced. Martha nodded, flipping through her recipe book. "My grandmother's beef stew can be stretched to feed an army," she said, "and it gets better sitting on the back of the stove all day." Sarah Murphy leaned forward to examine the recipe. "Is that the one Harold raves about? With the secret ingredient?" A smile ghosted across Martha's face. "Brewed coffee," she confided. "Just a quarter cup. Deepens the flavor." Soon other women were sharing their own recipes, dishes that had sustained mountain families through harsh winters and joyful gatherings alike. Martha found herself the unexpected authority, her decades of feeding lumber crews and harvest workers suddenly valuable again. "Write that one down," urged Beth Collins, the youngest of the group at 23. "No one makes biscuits like that anymore." Martha hesitated, then carefully tore the recipe from her book and handed it to Beth. "Family recipes should stay alive," she said, "not just sit in books." The simple gesture opened a floodgate. Soon recipes were being exchanged across generations, Martha's traditional methods meeting modern shortcuts, her careful measurements balanced against the younger women's improvisational cooking. On Saturday, Martha arrived at the building site early, supervising the setup of 3 folding tables beneath the shade canopy. The women worked together seamlessly, arranging coolers of drinks, setting out sandwich fixings for lunch, positioning Martha's beef stew in heavy Dutch ovens over portable burners for the afternoon meal. From this vantage point, Martha could observe the construction progress. The foundation was complete, floor joists laid, and subfloor installed. Today, wall framing would begin. The cabin would start to take vertical shape. Her gaze found Harold among the workers. He stood surrounded by younger men, demonstrating the proper angle for a structural joint. His hands, so often idle these past weeks, moved with remembered precision. The younger builders watched with genuine interest, respect evident in their attentive postures. "He's in his element," Louise observed, joining Martha at the serving table. "I haven't seen him this animated in years," Martha agreed. As morning stretched toward noon, Martha noticed Elijah moving between work groups, checking measurements against his blueprints, offering quiet suggestions. Despite the adults around him, the boy maintained a gentle authority born of expertise rather than age. When lunchtime arrived, workers approached the food tables in waves, filling plates with sandwiches and Martha's homemade potato salad. Elijah was among the last, waiting until others were served before approaching. "There you are," Martha said, filling a plate for him. "You need to keep your strength up." Elijah accepted the food with a shy smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Greene." "Martha," she corrected. "Anyone rebuilding my home gets to use my first name." As the boy ate, Martha studied him with grandmotherly interest. "You're too thin," she decided, "and too serious for 12. Elijah ducked his head, uncomfortable with the attention. "Can you cook?" Martha asked abruptly. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "Mom says I'm hopeless with anything except campfire hot dogs." Martha nodded decisively. "Then that's what I'll teach you. Every man should know how to feed himself properly." She tapped her recipe book. "We'll start with something simple. Biscuits, maybe." Surprise flickered across Elijah's face, followed by cautious interest. "I'd like that." The afternoon brought the rhythmic sound of hammers as wall frames took shape. Martha served her famous stew to appreciative workers, accepting compliments with the grace of a woman who had fed others all her life. Near day's end, she found Elijah alone, studying a newly raised wall frame with intense concentration. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Just making sure the angle is right for winter winds," he explained. "Your old cabin took the brunt of storms from the northwest. Martha was struck by his foresight, his awareness of the mountain's moods. "You notice things others don't," she observed. Elijah shrugged. "My dad says I was born with eyes that see what might be, not just what is." Martha thought of her recipe book, of knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations. "Wednesday," she said suddenly. "Come by the Johnsons after school. First cooking lesson." As workers packed up tools and secured the site against evening winds, Martha watched Harold walk the perimeter of what would become their new home. His step was lighter, his posture straighter. The project was healing something in him that medicine couldn't touch. Later that night, as Martha added the day's food expenses to their dwindling savings ledger, she felt Harold's hands on her shoulders. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? For feeding them, for making this feel less like charity and more like community." Martha covered his hand with hers. "That boy," she said quietly, "he's something special." Harold nodded. "He sees the cabin that isn't there yet, just like you saw a home on this mountain 60 years ago, when all I could see was wilderness." The cabin's skeletal frame now stood against the mountain sky, its wooden bones defining rooms that existed only in imagination and blueprints. 3 weeks into construction, the volunteer crew had developed a rhythm. Weekends saw the site bustling with a dozen or more workers, while weekday evenings brought smaller, more specialized teams. Harold arrived early one Tuesday evening, carrying a canvas bag that clinked with metal objects. He found Elijah alone at the site, double-checking the alignment of wall studs with a level and plumb line. "Evening," Harold called, setting down his bag. "Thought I might find you here." Elijah glanced up, offering a brief smile. "Just making sure everything's square before the roof trusses arrive tomorrow." Harold nodded, appreciating the boy's thoroughness. "I brought something," he said, opening his bag to reveal a collection of tarnished door hinges, brass knobs, and iron latches, salvaged from the old place. Elijah examined the hardware with interest. The hinges were hand-forged, bearing the marks of a craftsman's hammer from a century ago. "These are original to the cabin?" he asked. "Some," Harold confirmed. "Others I collected over the years, replacing the worn ones. Good metal. They don't make them like this anymore." Elijah turned a hinge over in his hands. "We could clean them up, reuse them." "That's what I was thinking," Harold agreed. "Might not match your modern design, though. They should be used," Elijah said decisively. "It's your home. They belong here." Something in the boy's tone made Harold look more closely at him. Despite his youth, Elijah possessed an innate understanding of what objects meant beyond their practical function, how they carried history and memory. As the evening progressed, more volunteers arrived. Bill Cooper brought a load of reclaimed wood for interior trim. Pastor Williams delivered donated windows from a church remodeling project. James Murphy arrived with the lumber supplier to discuss the upcoming delivery of roof trusses. "We've got a decision to make," James explained, unrolling Elijah's plans across a makeshift table. "Standard trusses would be quickest and cheapest, but they'd limit the ceiling height. Custom ones would give us that vaulted ceiling in the main room, but add about $2,000 to the cost." Harold frowned. The budget's already stretched thin. The original cabin had standard 8-foot ceilings, Bill Cooper pointed out. Worked fine for 60 years. "But the new design calls for vaulted ceilings," Elijah interjected quietly, "for better air circulation in summer and more efficient heating in winter." Harold could sense the boy's disappointment. This was one detail that mattered to his vision. "What if we hand-framed the rafters?" James suggested. "Old school style, like they would have done originally. More labor-intensive, but wouldn't add to the material costs." "I haven't hand-cut rafters in 30 years, Harold mused. "I've never done it," James admitted. "I know the theory," Elijah offered. "I've studied the techniques in my grandfather's carpentry books." The men exchanged glances. Theory was one thing, practice another. The roof was too critical a component to experiment with. "I could show you," Harold said suddenly. We used to frame roofs that way before prefab trusses became standard. Takes more time but gives you more character and strength if done right. The decision was made. Harold would lead a team to hand-frame the roof, with Elijah as his apprentice. Later that evening, as volunteers departed, Harold and Elijah sat on stacked lumber, examining the salvage door hardware. Elijah had brought a container of vinegar and salt, and they worked side by side, cleaning decades of tarnish from the metal pieces. "My grandfather had hinges like these," Elijah said, polishing a brass hinge to a soft glow. "From the old country," he said. "Where was he from?" Harold asked. "Norway. He built boats before coming to America." Harold nodded, unsurprised. The boy's methodical approach to building, his respect for materials, these were traits passed down through generations of craftsmen. "Did you always want to build things?" Harold asked. Elijah considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "I like making something useful," he said finally. "Something that lasts." As the last hinge was cleaned and laid out to dry, Harold gathered the pieces in a wooden box he'd constructed specifically for their safekeeping. "We'll use every one," he promised. "Old joining new." Elijah looked pleased. That's how it should be. Walking back to their respective vehicles, Harold noticed Elijah pause to study the framed doorway that would eventually become the cabin's entrance. "Problem?" Harold, "Just thinking," Elijah replied. "These hinges are heavier than modern ones. We'll need to reinforce the door jamb differently." Harold laughed softly. "You don't miss much, do you? My dad says I overthink everything." "Not overthinking," Harold corrected. "Just thorough. There's a difference." As Harold drove back to the Johnsons', the box of hinges secure on the seat beside him, he reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been resigned to leaving the mountain, his lifetime of skills and knowledge rendered irrelevant by age and disaster. Now, each evening brought new purpose, passing techniques to younger builders, seeing his experience valued, watching as old craftsmanship married modern methods. The cabin rising from the ruins would indeed be different from the one he'd built with Martha all those years ago. Better, perhaps. Not despite the integration of past and present, but because of it. Principal Donovan's office had the sterile efficiency common to educational administrators. Motivational posters, providing the only color against beige walls, achievement certificates framed with mathematical precision. The woman herself matched her surroundings, her gray suit and tightly bound hair, suggesting an orderliness that brooked no deviation. "Mrs. Murphy," she began, placing a folder on her desk, "I appreciate you coming in today." Sarah Murphy nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "Your message sounded urgent." "It is." Principal Donovan opened the folder, revealing a stack of absence notes, written in Sarah's neat handwriting. "Elijah has missed 11 school days in the past month. Add that to his late arrivals and early dismissals, and he's approaching the threshold for truancy." Sarah straightened. "All those absences were excused. I wrote the notes myself." "Yes," the principal acknowledged, "for family projects and community service. Miss Murphy, while I admire the values you're instilling, education must take precedence." "Elijah's education isn't suffering," Sarah countered. "His grades remain exceptional. For now," Principal Donovan conceded. "But patterns established now will affect his future opportunities." College admissions committees looked closely at attendance records. Sarah fought to maintain her composure. As a homeschool parent until last year, she had always believed learning happened everywhere, not just within classroom walls. Enrolling Elijah in public school had been a difficult decision, made primarily for his social development. "The cabin project is educational," she insisted. "Elijah's applying mathematics, physics, architectural principles." "Mrs. Murphy," the principal interrupted, "I don't question the value of practical experience, but there's a reason we have standardized curricula and attendance requirements." The meeting concluded with a warning further unexcused absences would trigger formal intervention. Sarah left feeling both defensive and uncertain, the folder of absence notes clutched in her hand like evidence in a trial. That evening, as James and Emma ate dinner, Sarah recounted the meeting. Elijah's place at the table remained empty. He was at the building site with Harold, working on roof joists. Maybe she has a point, James admitted reluctantly. Elijah's been at that site every spare minute, even weekends. You were the one who encouraged him, Sarah reminded her husband. I didn't expect it to consume him, James countered, or affect his schooling. The discussion continued until headlights swept across the front windows, signaling Elijah's return. He entered quietly, his clothes dusty, his expression tired but satisfied. There he is, James said, gesturing to the plate they'd kept warm. The master builder. Elijah smiled briefly, washing his hands before joining them. How's the roof coming? Emma asked. Good. Mr. Greene showed me how to cut bird's mouth joints for the rafters. They'll hold for 100 years, he says. James and Sarah exchanged glances. Son, James began carefully, we got a call from your principal today. Elijah's fork paused midway to his mouth. You've missed a lot of school, Sarah continued. They're concerned. I haven't fallen behind, Elijah protested. I've been doing all my assignments. It's not just about assignments, James explained. It's about being present, participating in class. Elijah set down his fork. The cabin has to be finished before winter. There's less than 2 months left before the first heavy snow. Your education comes first, James insisted. This is education, Elijah countered, his voice rising uncharacteristically. Mr. Greene is teaching me things I'd never learn in school. Real skills, important skills. Elijah, Sarah began. They're going to lose everything if we don't finish. He interrupted, emotion cracking his usual composure. Everything they've built their whole lives. The raw concern in his voice silenced his parents momentarily. This wasn't just about building a structure. It was about saving something Elijah perceived as irreplaceable. Before the discussion could continue, a knock sounded at the front door. James opened it to find Harold standing on the porch, hat in hand. Sorry to interrupt dinner, the older man said. I left some tools in Elijah's backpack. Need them for tomorrow's work. Sensing the tension, Harold hesitated in the doorway. Everything all right? James sighed. School's concerned about Elijah's absences. The project is affecting his attendance. Harold nodded, understanding immediately. That's why I'm here, actually, to talk about a compromise. Invited inside, Harold outlined his proposal. Elijah would attend school full-time, maintaining perfect attendance. In exchange, Harold would come to the school twice weekly during Elijah's study period to continue their work together, not on the physical cabin, but on the technical aspects of building. They would turn the project into an independent study, with Harold serving as mentor. I spoke with your principal this afternoon, Harold explained. She seemed amenable, provided there's proper documentation and educational objectives. The Murphys stared in surprise. This methodical planning was unexpected from a man they'd initially perceived as resistant to change. You did this for Elijah? Sarah asked. Harold glanced at the boy, a hint of affection softening his weathered features. He's done plenty for me. Seems fair to return the favor. Later, after Harold departed with his tools, James found Elijah at the kitchen table, homework spread before him. That was something, James commented. Harold going to bat for you like that? Elijah nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. He understands why this matters. James studied his son thoughtfully. You've made quite an impression on him. He's taught me a lot, Elijah replied simply. Goes both ways, I think, James observed. I haven't seen documentation for absences in his hand before tonight. He gestured to the small stack of absence notes that had followed them home from the principal's office. Elijah examined one, noting Harold's careful penmanship explaining the educational value of traditional construction techniques. The formal language and respectful tone revealed a side of Harold that few in the community had witnessed. The educated man behind the gruff exterior, the teacher within the builder. The blueprint fluttered in the strengthening wind, its edges curling despite the rocks weighing down the corners. Elijah lunged to catch it as a particularly strong gust threatened to tear it free from the makeshift table. "Weather's turning," James observed, scanning the darkening western sky, earlier than usual this year. October had arrived with unexpected ferocity, bringing the first dusting of snow to the highest peaks surrounding the valley. What had seemed like a comfortable timeline now felt precarious. As volunteers gathered for the weekend work session, Harold studied the weather-beaten blueprint, its once crisp lines now smudged from handling, corners dog-eared from constant reference. Over the past weeks, the document had evolved, notations added in different handwriting, modifications marked in colored pencil, coffee stains creating impromptu topographical features across the paper landscape. "We need to prioritize," Harold announced to the assembled volunteers. "Roof and exterior walls before anything else." Bill Cooper frowned at the blueprint. "That's still 2, maybe 3 weekends of work. Weather reports saying snow by next Thursday." A murmur of concern rippled through the group. Mountain snow didn't arrive politely. It descended with authority, making construction work dangerous if not impossible. "We can do it in 1, Elijah stated quietly. All eyes turned to the boy. "If we get more help," he continued, pointing to specific areas on the blueprint. "Focus teams on critical sections. Work longer hours." James shook his head. "Most folks here have other commitments, son. Jobs, families. Church has its harvest festival next weekend," Pastor Williams added. "Many of our regular volunteers will be there." Harold watched Elijah's face disappointment, battling with determination, the weight of responsibility evident in his furrowed brow. The boy had invested everything in this project, calculating each step with precision that adults twice his age might envy. Now nature itself seemed to be working against his carefully laid plans. "What if we modify the approach?" Harold suggested, tracing a weathered finger across the blueprint. "Get the structure closed in, even if it's not pretty. Something to keep out snow while we finish the interior work through winter." Elijah considered this, mentally recalculating. "We'd need to revise the sequence. Prioritize weatherproofing over finishing work." The group huddled closer as Elijah began marking the blueprint with new notations. Simplified roofing techniques, temporary solutions, contingency plans. The elegant design he'd originally envisioned was being compromised by practical necessity, yet he adapted with remarkable flexibility. By mid-afternoon, the revised plan was in motion. Volunteers were redistributed to critical tasks, supply runs reorganized to prioritize weatherproofing materials. The elegant blueprint that had guided them for weeks was now marked with hasty revisions, coffee stains, and fingerprints from workers checking measurements. As daylight faded, unusually early with the approaching storm front, Harold found Elijah alone on what would eventually be the front porch. The boy sat with the battered blueprint spread across his knees, making additional calculations by flashlight. "You should head home," Harold told him. "Getting cold?" Elijah nodded without looking up. "Just finishing these adjustments for tomorrow's crew." Harold lowered himself onto the rough planking beside him, joints protesting the movement. "Plans change," he said after a moment. "Nature makes sure of that." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice tight with frustration. "But I promised we'd have you home before first snow." "Home is relative," Harold said thoughtfully. "Right now, it's the Johnsons' spare bedroom. Before that, it was a cabin that took 30 years to feel like home. After Martha and I got married, we lived in a tent on this very spot for 2 months, while I built the first room." Elijah looked up, surprised. "A tent? Canvas walls and a dirt floor?" Harold confirmed. Martha hung curtains inside that tent, if you can believe it. Said it made it feel more permanent. The boy's expression softened slightly. You weren't worried about snow then? Oh, we were terrified, Harold chuckled. First flurry nearly sent us running back to her parents' place, but we stayed. Finished that first room just before the heavy stuff came. A comfortable silence settled between them as the wind whispered through half-finished walls. The blueprint wasn't perfect then either, Harold continued, tapping the paper on Elijah's knee. Had to change things as I went. Material shortages, mistakes in my calculations, Martha's suggestions. The last word carried affectionate humor. Elijah studied the weather-beaten document before him. Its smudges and revisions now seemed less like failures and more like a record of adaptation. It's still a good design, Harold assured him, just evolving. A snowflake drifted down, then another, landing on the blueprint. Instead of brushing them away, Elijah watched as they melted into the paper, adding yet another mark to the document's history. We should get this inside before it's ruined, he said, carefully folding the damp blueprint. Too late for that, Harold observed with a wry smile. But that doesn't make it less valuable. As they walked to their respective vehicles, the snowfall intensified, not yet the heavy blanket that would eventually coat the mountain, but a warning of what approached. Harold glanced back at the partially completed cabin, its skeleton silhouetted against the darkening sky. It'll stand, Elijah said, following his gaze. Maybe not exactly as planned, but it'll stand. Harold nodded, recognizing in the boy's words an understanding that went beyond building materials and architectural designs, an acceptance that some of life's most enduring structures are those shaped by adaptation rather than rigid adherence to original plans. The cabin's roof was nearly complete, dark green metal panels reflecting the wan November sunlight. Despite the early snowfall, the volunteer crew had managed to enclose the structure, creating a weather-tight shell that would allow interior work to continue through winter. Windows were installed, doors hung on their salvaged hinges, and the propane heater Harold had sourced from a retiring neighbor made the space workable even on the coldest days. Martha stood at the Johnsons' kitchen window, watching Harold climb into Frank's truck for the day's work at the site. Something in his movements caught her attention, a stiffness beyond his usual morning aches, a momentary grimace as he pulled himself into the passenger seat. He's pushing too hard, she murmured. Louise joined her at the window. Men his age should be playing checkers at the general store, not framing houses. Try telling him that, Martha sighed. The two women spent the morning preparing meals for the weekend volunteers, but Martha's mind remained on Harold. At 60 they'd discussed slowing down. At 70 they'd made token concessions to age. A handrail here, a step stool there. At 80 they'd settled into a rhythm of careful management, acknowledging limitations while maintaining independence. Now, Harold moved as though he'd reversed the clock, taking on physical tasks that men 20 years his junior approached with caution. Shortly after noon, the kitchen phone rang. Louise answered, her expression shifting to concern as she listened. "It's Frank," she said, covering the receiver. "Harold's having chest pains." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The mountain community had no hospital, only a small clinic staffed 3 days a week by a physician's assistant. Frank had driven Harold directly there, where the PA administered nitroglycerin and arranged transport to the regional hospital, 60 miles away. By evening, Martha sat beside Harold's hospital bed, watching monitors track his heartbeat with steady green pulses. Just a warning, the doctor had assured them after tests ruled out a major heart attack, but a warning to be heeded. Now Harold fidgeted with the hospital bracelet on his wrist, frustrated by confinement. "Unnecessary fuss," he grumbled. "Probably just indigestion." "Indigestion doesn't show stress patterns on an EKG," Martha countered, her tone sharper than intended. Behind the sharpness lay fear, the same fear she'd carried through 60 years of loving this stubborn man. "They're releasing me tomorrow," Harold said. "I'll be back at the site by afternoon." "You most certainly will not," Martha stated firmly. Doctor said 2 weeks of rest. 2 weeks. Harold's expression crumpled. The interior framing is scheduled. Elijah's counting on my help with the stone facing for the fireplace. Elijah would rather have you alive than have a perfect fireplace, Martha said softly, taking his hand. Harold fell silent, staring at the ceiling. They both recognized the truth beneath his frustration, not just concern for the project, but fear of being sidelined, of becoming irrelevant. When Martha returned to the Johnsons the following day to pack an overnight bag, she found Elijah sitting on the front porch steps, Harold's old wooden toolbox beside him. Mum told me about Mr. Greene, he said, standing quickly. Is he okay? Martha nodded, touched by the genuine concern on the boy's face. Just a warning, the doctor said, but he needs rest. The crew wanted me to bring him this, Elijah explained, gesturing to the toolbox. For when he's feeling better. Martha recognized the box. Harold had crafted it decades ago, each compartment sized for specific tools, the lid inlaid with contrasting woods that formed their initials. She'd thought it lost in the storm. We found it under debris last week, Elijah continued. I restored it, replaced the hinges, refinished the wood. Martha ran her fingers over the loath surface, feeling the care in the restoration. He'll be touched, she said. But I'm afraid he's under strict orders not to use tools for a while. It's not for using, Elijah explained. It's for planning. He opened the lid to reveal not Harold's usual carpentry tools, but drafting implements. Pencils, a small-scale ruler, templates, a compass. I thought he could work on designs, Elijah explained. The interior details, built-ins for the bedroom, the reading nook you mentioned wanting. Martha blinked back sudden tears. This boy, barely 12, understood what Harold needed more than any doctor, not just rest, but purpose. The following weekend, Harold sat propped in his hospital bed, the restored toolbox open across his lap. On the overbed table lay sketches for cabinets, detailed drawings of molding profiles, and notes on the placement of electrical outlets and light fixtures. Elijah perched in the visitor's chair, notebook open, listening intently as Harold explained the mathematics behind a perfect archway. The curve has to be just right, Harold insisted. Too shallow and it looks weak, too pronounced and it dominates the space. Elijah nodded, making careful notes. I'll show the framing crew tomorrow. Make sure they understand the proportion. As the boy left, promising to return with updated progress photos, Martha noticed the change in her husband. Still physically weakened, but mentally energized, his expertise finding new expression through Elijah's willing hands. That night, as Harold slept, Martha opened the toolbox once more. Inside, she found a small note tucked between drafting tools, written in Elijah's precise handwriting. A good builder knows when to let others carry the load. A great builder knows how to guide them while they do. She smiled, recognizing the words as Harold's own wisdom he'd once shared, that had now returned to sustain him when he needed it most. December transformed the mountain with heavy snow that hushed the world beneath a white blanket. Inside the cabin, work continued at a steady pace, insulation installed, drywall hung and taped, electrical wiring threaded through walls. Though exterior work had paused until spring, the enclosed structure provided a warm shelter for the finishing touches that would transform the building into a home. Harold, now recovered enough to visit the site regularly, though under Martha's watchful eye, stood in what would become their living room, supervising the installation of the stone fireplace. Built with river rocks gathered from the creek that bordered their property, the hearth echoed the one from their original cabin, but with subtle improvements, a more efficient draft, a wider mantel, a stone bench that would absorb and radiate heat. Perfect, Harold nodded to Bill Cooper, who had taken over as lead mason. Martha will appreciate that seating area on cold mornings. Elijah's design, Bill commented, stepping back to admire their work. Boy thinks of everything. Harold smiled with something close to paternal pride. In the weeks since his health scare, Elijah had stepped into a leadership role that belied his age, coordinating volunteers, troubleshooting problems, ensuring Harold's vision merged seamlessly with his own innovations. The afternoon brought a special delivery. The cabin's front door, a solid oak piece that James Murphy had been crafting in his workshop for weeks. As volunteers helped carry it in, Harold noticed Elijah hanging back, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his posture. "Something wrong?" Harold asked as the door was temporarily positioned in its frame. "I made something," Elijah said, reaching into his backpack. "For the cabin, for you and Mrs. Greene." He withdrew a wooden plaque, roughly 15 inches long and 8 inches high. Carved into its surface was the silhouette of the mountain range, visible from their front porch, detailed with remarkable precision. Beneath it, in carefully executed lettering, "Green Mountain Haven." Harold took the sign, running his fingers over the smooth wood and crisp carving. "You made this yourself?" Elijah nodded. "Dad helped with some of the writing, but I did the design and carving." "It's beautiful," Harold said, genuinely moved. "But I'm not sure about the name. Don't you like it?" Elijah asked, disappointment evident. "It's not that," Harold assured him. "It's just, well, a home's name should reflect its story, don't you think? And this cabin's story includes more than just Martha and me." Understanding dawned on Elijah's face. "You want to change it?" Harold nodded, looking thoughtful. "What about Green Murphy Haven? Seems fitting, considering how much of yourself you've put into these walls." Elijah stared at him, clearly stunned by the suggestion. "You'd put our name on your home? Why not? Your fingerprints are all over it, your design, your vision." Harold gestured around them. "Besides, a name should tell the truth. And the truth is, this place wouldn't exist without you." James Murphy, overhearing the conversation as he adjusted the door hinges, paused in his work. "That's quite an honor, Harold." "An earned one," Harold replied firmly. The moment was interrupted as Martha arrived with a group of women, carrying containers of food for the workers. She noticed the sign in Harold's hands and came over to examine it. "What's this?" she asked. "Our cabin sign," Harold explained, "though we're discussing a slight modification to the name." Martha studied the beautifully carved piece. "Green Mountain Haven," she read. "It's lovely, Elijah. Harold wants to change it to Green Murphy Haven," James explained, watching his son's face carefully. Martha looked between Harold and Elijah, understanding the significance immediately. "I think that's perfect," she said softly. "This home belongs to both our stories now." Elijah's usual composure wavered slightly, his eyes brightening with emotion. He quickly blinked away. "I can make a new one," he offered. "No need to start over," Harold said. "Just add to what you've created, like we did with the cabin itself." Later, as the winter sun set early behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow, the volunteers gathered for a small ceremony. The front door was officially hung on its hinges, the temporary construction entrance now replaced with the proper entryway. Harold insisted that Elijah be the one to install the modified sign, Green Murphy Haven, now carved beneath the mountain silhouette, the addition integrated so skillfully it appeared part of the original design. "Every home needs a proper name," Harold announced to the assembled group, "something that tells its story and welcomes those who enter." Pastor William stepped forward with a small bottle of olive oil. "In the old tradition," he explained, "we bless the doorway through which all life of the home will pass." A hush fell over the gathering as the pastor anointed the doorframe, his prayer acknowledging not just the physical structure, but the community that had raised it. A modern barn-raising born of both necessity and love. As darkness fell and volunteers departed, Harold, Martha, and Elijah remained behind, standing in the doorway beneath the newly mounted sign. No words were needed as they shared the moment, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, a destroyed home, an impossible dream, and the bridge between generations that had made restoration possible. From disaster had come not just rebuilding, but renewal, a home whose very name now told the story of what can happen when determination transcends age, when wisdom flows between old and young, when a community remembers that its strength lies in caring for its most vulnerable members. As January's bitter cold gripped the mountain, interior work on the cabin continued at a steady pace. Walls were painted in the warm, buttery yellow Martha had chosen. Hardwood floors installed using a combination of salvaged boards from the original structure and new oak planks, and kitchen cabinets mounted according to Harold's exacting specification. The Johnsons had graciously extended their hospitality through the winter, but both Martha and Harold grew increasingly eager to return to their own space, their own routines, their own privacy. Though never stated directly, the burden of dependency weighed heavily on both of them. The plumbing inspector signed off yesterday, James reported during one of the regular progress meetings held at the Johnsons' kitchen table. Electrical final is scheduled for next Tuesday. What about the move-in timeline? Harold asked, trying to keep the impatience from his voice. James exchanged glances with Elijah before answering. Officially, we're still looking at early February. There are some finishing touches. We don't need finishing touches, Harold interrupted. Just a functioning bathroom and kitchen. The rest can wait. Martha placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. We've waited this long, she reminded him. A few more weeks won't hurt. But later that evening, as Martha prepared for bed in the Johnsons' guest room, she found Harold sitting on the edge of the mattress, staring at a prescription bottle with an expression of profound frustration. 3 pills a day, he muttered. Morning, noon and night. For the rest of my life. Martha sat beside him, the mattress dipping slightly under their combined weight. Small price for keeping you around, she said lightly. Harold's expression didn't change. I'm not the man I was, Martha. Can't build like I used to. Can't even carry my own furniture without risking another heart episode. None of us are who we were, she replied pragmatically. That's what living does to a person. The following Saturday brought an unexpected snowstorm, forcing the cancellation of the scheduled workday. By Sunday afternoon, however, the mountain roads had been cleared enough for essential travel. Harold convinced Frank to drive him to the cabin site, claiming he needed to check that no pipes had frozen during the temperature drop. As they pulled up to the cabin, Harold was surprised to see Elijah's father's truck already parked outside. Looks like someone beat us here, Frank commented. Inside they found Elijah working alone, installing what appeared to be handrails along the short hallway leading to the bedroom. What's this? Harold asked, running his hand along the smooth wooden rail. Elijah looked up, momentarily startled by their arrival. Oh, it's just something I thought might be useful, he said, returning to his work with focused precision. Harold watched as the boy secured the mounting brackets with practiced movements. The handrails were beautifully crafted, from cherry wood, their design consistent with the cabin's overall aesthetic, functional elements disguised as decorative details. Looking around, Harold began to notice other subtle features he hadn't registered before. A slight ramp instead of a step at the back entrance, electrical outlets positioned higher than standard to reduce bending, lever door handles rather than traditional knobs, a pull-out step stool concealed in the cabinetry toe kick. These modifications, Harold said slowly. They weren't in the original plans. Elijah concentrated on aligning the final bracket. I added them as we went along, he admitted. Just small changes. For us, Harold realized, because we're old. The boy finally looked up, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. For safety, he corrected, and convenience. Harold felt a complex wave of emotions, gratitude tangled with pride, mingled with the bitter acknowledgement of his own limitations. These thoughtful adaptations represented both Elijah's care and a reminder of Harold's declining capabilities. Smart design, he said finally, echoing Bill Cooper's earlier assessment of Elijah's work. I didn't want to make it obvious, Elijah explained, relaxing slightly at Harold's apparent acceptance. My grandfather hated anything that made him feel old. But after your heart scare, I thought, He trailed off, suddenly unsure. Harold nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. "You thought we might need some help, but wouldn't want to ask for it." "Yes, sir." Frank, who had been examining the kitchen modifications with interest, joined them. "Kid thinks of everything," he commented. "These pull-out shelves in the lower cabinets are genius. Louise would love these in our kitchen." As they continued touring the cabin, Harold discovered more of Elijah's thoughtful innovations: a shower with both fixed and handheld sprayer, a kitchen island at a height perfect for Martha's 5'3" frame, extra lighting in areas where tasks required precision. None of these modifications called attention to themselves as accommodations for age or disability. They were simply intelligent design choices that anticipated needs before they became problems. Later, as Frank drove them back to the Johnsons', Harold remained unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" Frank asked. "Cabin, looking good, I thought." "It is," Harold agreed. "Better than good." "Then what's bothering you?" Harold gazed out the passenger window at the snow-covered landscape. "When you're young," he said finally, "you build for today. When you get older, you realize you should have built for tomorrow." Frank nodded, understanding dawning. "The boy built for your tomorrows." "Yes," Harold replied softly. "All the ones he could imagine." The women of the mountain community gathered in Louise Johnson's living room, a sea of busy hands working on the quilt spread across their laps. What had begun as a simple housewarming gift had evolved into an elaborate tapestry of community memory, each square telling a story, each stitch representing a connection. "Martha will be back from her doctor's appointment by 4, Louise reminded them. "We need to finish the binding today if we want this ready for the move-in." Sarah Murphy nodded, her needle flashing in the afternoon light. "Elias says they're doing the final walkthrough tomorrow. If all goes well, the Greens can move in this weekend." 6 months from disaster to new home, Beth Collins marveled. "I still can't believe it." "Belief had little to do with it," commented Eleanor Wilson, the oldest among them at 85. "Hard work and that boy's determination made it happen." The quilt taking shape under their collective efforts was unlike any traditional pattern. In the center, Louise had recreated the outline of the original cabin using fabrics salvaged from Martha's curtains and upholstery. Surrounding this were squares contributed by different families, some depicting mountain scenes, others incorporating fabric with personal significance. Pastor William's wife had contributed a square made from her husband's old clerical stole, symbolizing the prayer service held after the storm. The Henderson family's square featured fragments from flour sacks, acknowledging the meals they'd provided during construction. Sarah Murphy's creation included scraps from Elijah's outgrown flannel shirts, arranged in a pattern reminiscent of building blueprints. "Did anyone do something with this?" asked Maggie Cooper, holding up a scrap of faded blue fabric. Louise examined it. "That's from Harold's old work shirt. Martha saved it from the ruins. She was hoping someone could incorporate it." Maggie considered the fabric. "It would work perfectly for the sky and my mountain scene." As they worked, conversation flowed freely between women who had known each other for decades and those newer to the community. They shared stories of Martha and Harold, his gruff kindness when neighbors needed help with repairs, her quiet generosity during illnesses and births. "Remember when they took in the Pattersons after that rock slide in '92, Eleanor reminisced. 4 extra people in that little cabin for nearly a month. And how Martha organized the school supplies drive every August," added Louise. "Made sure no child started the year without what they needed." The women worked steadily through the afternoon, their collective memory stitching together not just fabric, but the invisible bonds of community life. The quilt became a tangible representation of what had always existed between them: mutual support, shared history, the understanding that no one survived mountain life alone. As the sun began its early winter descent, they added the final touches: a hand-embroidered label on the back with the date and occasion, a decorative border of pine trees and mountains, tiny glass beads that caught the light like morning dew. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed as they spread the finished quilt across Louise's bed for a final inspection. The creation before them told a story more eloquent than words, a patchwork of lives interconnected, of hardship transformed through collective effort, of a community that understood the true meaning of neighboring. "Do you think they'll understand what it means?" Beth asked, smoothing a wrinkle from one corner. Eleanor smiled, her weathered face creasing with warmth. "They've lived on this mountain longer than most of us. They'll understand." When Martha returned from her appointment, the women had already packed away the quilt in a cedar box tied with ribbon. Their secret project would remain hidden until the official move-in day, when the full community would gather to welcome the Greenes home. That evening, Martha sat with Harold at the Johnsons' kitchen table, reviewing the final inspection checklist one last time. "It's really happening," she said softly. "After everything, we're going home." "A new home," Harold amended. "But on the same ground," Martha countered. "With the same view, the same sunrise." Harold nodded, understanding what she meant. The physical structure was new, but the essence of home transcended walls and roof. Home was the mountain itself, the familiar patterns of light across the valley, the knowledge of belonging to a particular place in the world. "I packed most of our things today," Martha continued. "It didn't amount to much in the end. We travel lighter now," Harold observed. What remained unsaid between them was the awareness that this home would likely be their last. A place built, not just for their present needs, but with foresight for the challenges that inevitably accompanied aging. Elijah's thoughtful adaptations acknowledged this reality while preserving their dignity and independence. As they prepared for bed in what would soon no longer be their temporary shelter, Martha found herself unexpectedly tearful. "The Johnsons have been so good to us," she explained when Harold noticed. "Everyone has. We'll repay it," Harold assured her. "Different ways, perhaps, but we will." Martha nodded, understanding that gratitude, like the community quilt, took many forms, sometimes visible and tangible, other times woven into the unseen fabric of daily life. February dawned with unseasonable warmth, as if nature itself approved of the timing. Snow remained in shadowed hollows, but the path to the newly completed cabin stood clear and dry beneath a brilliant blue sky. Vehicles began arriving mid-morning, trucks and SUVs navigating the mountain roads with practiced ease. Parking along the widened driveway, James Murphy had insisted on creating for when you have visitors. Children tumbled from back seats, clutching carefully wrapped packages. Adults carried covered dishes and folding chairs. Inside the empty cabin, Elijah made final adjustments, checking that every window opened smoothly, that every door hung perfectly level, that the stone fireplace drew properly. Though professionals had handled the electrical and plumbing, almost every other aspect of the construction bore his influence, from the precise angle of the roof designed to shed heavy snow loads, to the custom bookshelves built to accommodate Harold's specific collection. The inspection had been passed, the occupancy permit issued. All that remained was the ceremonial handing over, the moment when construction site officially became home. In his pocket, Elijah carried a special creation he'd been working on for weeks. Using traditional blacksmithing techniques learned from videos and books, he'd forged an iron key unlike any modern equivalent, substantial and ornate, more symbolic than practical in an age of standardized locks. Its handle incorporated design elements from both the original cabin and the new structure, while the shaft and teeth were precisely cut to operate the front door's deadbolt. As noon approached, Pastor Williams gathered the assembled community on the front porch, where Harold and Martha stood arm in arm, visibly moved by the turnout. "Neighbors," the pastor began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "we come together today to celebrate more than just a building. We celebrate resilience, community, and the bridge between generations that made this day possible." Harold's gaze swept over the crowd, familiar faces that had become even more familiar during the months of construction. Bill Cooper, who'd taken time off work to perfect the stone fireplace. The Henderson family, who donated lumber and provided meals. Louise and Frank Johnson, whose spare bedroom had become a temporary haven. And standing slightly apart, the Murphy family, James and Sarah watching proudly as their son waited with barely contained anticipation, the weight of the moment evident in his serious expression. 6 months ago, Pastor Williams continued, we witnessed destruction. Today we celebrate creation. Not just the creation of walls and roof, but the creation of something less tangible, a testament to what we can accomplish when we come together. Martha squeezed Harold's hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The past months had been challenging, but they had also brought unexpected gifts, new friendships, deeper connections, the discovery that independence and interdependence were not mutually exclusive concepts. And now the pastor announced, turning toward Elijah, I believe someone has a presentation to make. Elijah stepped forward, suddenly self-conscious before the gathered crowd. Though he'd spent months directing adults twice and 3 times his age, speaking publicly remained difficult for the quiet, thoughtful boy. Mr. and Mrs. Greene, he began, his voice steadying as he focused on the elderly couple. When we started this project, you trusted me with your home. Today I want to return that trust. From his pocket, he withdrew the handcrafted key, its metal gleaming in the winter sunlight. This key operates the front door lock, he explained. I made it by hand, the old way, like the hinges from your original cabin. It's one of a kind, just like this home. Harold accepted the key, its weight substantial in his palm. Unlike the lightweight, mass-produced keys of modern houses, this one had presence, the physical embodiment of security and belonging. The best locks, Elijah continued, finding confidence in the technical aspects, have pins that align perfectly when the right key is inserted. It's about precise matching, each part serving its purpose exactly. Harold nodded, understanding the metaphor. The rebuilding process had been similar, each person contributing their specific skills, each element serving its unique function, creating something stronger than any individual component. Would you like to try it? Elijah asked, gesturing toward the door behind them. Harold handed the key to Martha. You should do the honors, he said softly. You're the one who makes any place we live a home. With steady hands belying her 80 years, Martha inserted the key into the lock. Smooth click of the mechanism brought a spontaneous cheer from the gathered crowd. As the door swung open, Harold and Martha stood on the threshold of their new beginning. Beyond the doorway lay rooms filled with light, some furnishings salvaged and restored, others donated or purchased new, all arranged according to Martha's specific instructions relayed through Elijah's careful notes. Welcome home, Elijah said simply. Martha impulsively pulled the boy into an embrace, propriety forgotten in the emotion of the moment. Harold's hand found Elijah's shoulder, a firm grip conveying what words could not adequately express. Together, they crossed the threshold, the elderly couple and the young boy, whose vision had created not just a structure of wood and stone, but a legacy of resilience, connection, and the quiet power of believing in possibilities where others saw only ruins. Spring arrived on the mountain with a gentle persistence that mirrored the Greenes' adjustment to their new home. Snowdrops pushed through melting drifts, creeks swelled with runoff, and the cabin settled into its foundation with soft creaks and sighs that became familiar night sounds to its occupants. The evening ritual had become Harold's favorite part of each day. After dinner, he would ease into the handcrafted rocking chair positioned perfectly on the covered porch. From this vantage point, he could watch the mountain's shifting moods, cloud shadows racing across distant slopes, deer emerging cautiously from forest edges, the occasional eagle soaring on thermals high above the valley. Martha would often join him, bringing mugs of tea or coffee depending on the evening's chill. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, other times they planned modest garden expansions or discussed letters from their distant children, who had been surprised and moved by news of the community's rebuilding efforts. On this particular evening, Harold recognized the sound of an approaching vehicle, the distinctive rhythm of James Murphy's truck, navigating the final curve before their driveway. Moments later, Elijah appeared, carrying his school backpack and a small toolbox. "Mr. Greene," he called, climbing the porch steps. "I finished that weather station project. Thought you might want to see it." Since the move-in day 6 weeks earlier, Elijah had continued his regular visits, initially to address minor adjustments to the new home, then evolving into a relationship that defied simple categorization. Not quite grandfather and grandson, more than mentor and student, they had found common ground in shared projects and quiet conversations. "Let's see it then," Harold replied, clearing space on the small porch table. Elijah carefully removed a wooden box from his backpack. Inside, a combination of digital components and traditional mechanical gauges created an elegant fusion of old and new technologies. It measures temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed, Elijah explained, pointing to each element. "The anemometer needs to go on the roof peak, but the rest can mount right here on the porch rail." Harold studied the craftsmanship with genuine appreciation. "Your design?" "Mostly," Elijah admitted. "Dad helped with the weatherproofing for the outdoor sensors." Martha emerged from inside, carrying a plate of oatmeal cookies still warm from the oven. "I thought I heard your voice," she said, smiling at Elijah. "Just in time for the first batch." As they enjoyed the cookies, Harold and Elijah discussed optimal placement for the weather instruments. Their conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of those who understand each other's thought processes. Technical details interspersed with practical considerations, occasional disagreements resolved through reasoned compromise. Martha watched them with quiet satisfaction. Harold had always been a man of few words, especially after retirement narrowed his social circle. Now he spoke more freely, animated by the exchange of ideas and the pleasure of passing on knowledge accumulated over decades of mountain living. "How's school?" Martha asked, when there was a natural pause in the technical discussion. "Good," Elijah replied. "My science teacher liked the cabin design project, said it showed exceptional understanding of environmental adaptation." "High praise," Harold nodded. "Well deserved." "I've been thinking about architecture," Elijah continued, a hint of shyness creeping into his voice. "Maybe studying it after high school." "You'd be excellent," Martha encouraged. "You have the mathematical mind for it, and the artistic eye, and the practical experience," Harold added. "Many architects never actually build what they design. Gives you an advantage, knowing how things work in the real world." Elijah ducked his head at the praise, but his pleasure was evident. "I was hoping you might write a letter someday, for college application." "We'd be honored," Martha assured him, reaching over to squeeze his hand. As the evening light softened toward dusk, Elijah and Harold mounted the weather station components. The barometer and temperature gauge on the porch rail, the wind vane and anemometer higher up where they could catch unobstructed air currents. Martha brought more mugs of coffee and settled into her own chair. Not a rocker like Harold's, but a deep-seated Adirondack perfectly angled for her shorter frame. Together the three of them watched as the instruments came to life, needles settling into position, digital displays recording the mountain's vital signs. 72 degrees, Elijah noted. Barometric pressure rising slightly. "With weather tomorrow," Harold confirmed, feeling the rightness of the moment, the perfect alignment of experience and innovation, wisdom and fresh perspective. As darkness gathered, fireflies began to appear along the forest edge, their intermittent glow a counterpoint to emerging stars. Elijah stayed longer than usual, drawn into Harold's stories of how mountain weather patterns had shifted over decades, each observation now given context through the measurements from their newly installed instruments. When James eventually arrived to pick up his son, he declined Martha's invitation to come inside, sensing the contentment of the scene before him. His son perched on the porch rail, animatedly discussing cloud formations with Harold, while Martha worked quietly on her knitting, adding her own observations occasionally. "Looks like you've got a junior meteorologist on your hands," James commented as Elijah reluctantly gathered his things. "He's got the mind for it," Harold agreed. "Sees patterns, makes connections. He talks about you folks all the time," James said, his voice lowering slightly. "What you're teaching him, the stories you share, it means a lot to him." Harold nodded. understanding the unspoken gratitude. "The learning goes both ways," he replied simply. After they departed, Harold and Martha remained on the porch, watching headlights disappear around the mountain curve. The new weather instruments ticked and hummed softly, measuring invisible forces that shaped their environment. "He's a remarkable boy," Martha observed. "He'll go far," Harold agreed. "Further than this mountain." The thought brought both pride and a twinge of melancholy. The natural progression of nurturing a young mind meant eventually watching it journey beyond the boundaries of their shared space. But that was tomorrow's concern. For now, the rocking chair on the porch, the home rebuilt through collective determination, and the bridge between generations were enough. A full year had passed since the storm that destroyed the Greenes' original cabin. Summer dressed the mountain in lush greenery. Wildflowers dotted the meadows surrounding the new structure, and birds nested in eaves carefully designed to accommodate them. Martha knelt in the rich soil of her garden, transplanting herb seedlings with practiced care. The raised beds, another of Elijah's thoughtful adaptations, allowed her to pursue her passion without the back pain that had increasingly limited her gardening in recent years. "Elijah's here," Harold called from the porch, where his rocking chair had worn smooth patches in the cedar planking. Martha looked up to see the boy, taller now at 13, his frame beginning to hint at the man he would become, making his way up the path. In his arms he carried what appeared to be a small tree sapling, its root ball wrapped carefully in burlap. "What's that you've got?" Martha asked, removing her gardening gloves as she stood. "Red oak," Elijah replied. "From the forestry project at school. Each student got one to plant." Harold descended the porch steps with deliberate care. "Good choice. Slow growing, but they last for generations. That's why I thought it should be here," Elijah explained, "where it can grow undisturbed." Together, the three of them selected the perfect spot, far enough from the cabin to allow full growth, positioned where future branches wouldn't threaten the roof, yet visible from the porch where so many evening conversations had unfolded. Harold fetched shovels from the tool shed he and Elijah had built the previous autumn. They worked as a team, Elijah digging the primary hole, Harold widening it to his specifications, Martha preparing the soil amendments she insisted would give the sapling its best start. "In 20 years, it'll provide good shade," Harold noted as they carefully positioned the young tree. "In 50, it'll be magnificent," Martha added, gently patting soil around the exposed roots. Elijah stood back, viewing their work with satisfaction. "In 100, it'll be a landmark." The timeline stretched beyond any of their individual lives, yet the act of planting connected them to that distant future, an investment in tomorrow made by today's hands. After securing the sapling with stakes and twine to protect it from mountain winds, they sat together on the porch steps, sharing the lemonade Martha had prepared that morning. The conversation meandered comfortably, touching on Elijah's school achievements, Harold's progress on carving a set of chess pieces, Martha's plans for canning summer vegetables. As afternoon shadows lengthened, James Murphy's truck appeared on the road below, coming to collect his son. Harold and Martha walked Elijah to the driveway, pausing by the newly planted oak. "It needs water every other day for the first month," Martha reminded him. "More if we don't get rain. I'll check on it whenever I visit," Elijah promised. "Which had better be often," Harold added gruffly, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. As the truck disappeared down the mountain road, Harold and Martha remained by the sapling, its slender form casting a barely perceptible shadow in the golden evening light. "Amazing what can grow from disaster," Martha observed quietly. Harold nodded, his gaze taking in their rebuilt home, the thriving garden, and the young tree that would continue reaching skyward long after they were gone. Like the sapling, Elijah would continue growing, his roots strengthened by the connections formed during that pivotal year. And like the cabin, the Greenes had been rebuilt, not just their physical dwelling, but their sense of place in the community, their understanding of independence, their appreciation for the cyclical nature of giving and receiving. The storm had taken much, but what had grown in its aftermath proved far more enduring than what had been lost.